had a big old solstice celebration here in Massachusetts, here in Beckett, last week, and one of the questions that was asked to us was, why are things so crazy? Why are things, this was by a gray hair asking these questions because those of you that are in your 50s, in your 60s, in your 70s have never seen the situation unfolding in the way that it has. And yet we would say to you, we have been asking you the same question for decades. And that is the dynamic of who is it that you're going to be? Because that's the divine imperative that is pushing each and every one of you. But in order to really understand it, we have often said that you need to use the analogy of your physical growth, but we want to take it back to, maybe around the time of, and please understand something here. Just as you have a childhood in physicality, you have a childhood of a species. Just as you had an adolescence in physicality, you have an adolescence as a species. Just as you have an adulthood, hopefully, as an individual, then so too you have an adulthood as a species. And if you really want to understand the dynamic of going on, that is going on, it is really as simple and as complex as growth. And so in the dynamic of understanding that, let us go back to pre-World War II, or even pre-World War I. When you, in the dynamics of you, it's almost as if you look at the way you perpetrated war in those times. It was almost as if they were toy soldiers. But the carnage was almost too much for you to bear as individuals, and so there was a natural repugnance to the dynamic of that type of war, and so war kept improving, and it kept driving the dynamic. Just like a child plays with soldiers, so too as children did you play with life and play with each other. And so, that dynamic went on for many, many years, and it moved into the dynamics of World War I, still very childlike, still very, but then, technological advances, the tanks and poison gas and all of that stuff allowed the carnage to become even more awful and more difficult, and you reacted even more vehemently in that dynamic. But because of the dynamic of the unfairness that exists in what shall we say, leave children to their own devices, and they develop a dynamic of hierarchy. They develop a dynamic of power over. They have kings and they have generals and they have all of that. Look at your world, dear ones. It's still very childlike in its own way, but you're now doing that with more modern technology. So here we have a dynamic that really, was very childlike up until World War II, and then after World War I, and then after World War I, the reaction was to punish, 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 and that's the dynamic that went on with Germany and some of the other Axis powers in that dynamic, and because of the childlike power over, then you wound up having the reaction of fascism and all of that. And you must understand, it's all part of the energetic growth dynamic, and we're just tracing it and we're only touching on little pieces here and there, so that you might begin to understand the emotional flavor of your history as a species, especially the past, what shall we say, 1,000 years or so. And so World War II came, and it was very black and white in its own way. The United States at that time was very, what shall we say, naive, immature, very agricultural, very bucolic in its own way. Yes, there were cities, there was technological advance, there was that whole dynamic, but ultimately things were pretty laid back in this country. You had been suffering through the depression, you had been suffering through the dynamic of the Dust Bowl, and so it's almost like adolescent wounding was going on that time. You were being stressed, and it was like you were in your early adolescence, as in America especially. And so, from that dynamic, power being what it is, and people being what they are, and do not get us wrong, we're not saying that the dynamics were not manipulated. We're not saying that things were not exacerbated in certain ways, but if everything is part of the consciousness of all that is, in fact, was it not always a movement toward being more? Wasn't it always, and isn't it now even, always a movement to being real and becoming more and discovering who you really are as a humanity? So, the one of the crucial years was coming up after World War II, and see, this is the problem. You won World War II, and you got a really big idea of yourselves. It's where that whole dynamic of entitlement came from in the mid to late 40s after you had won the war. The arrogance, you could have, but you weren't mature enough. You could have moved into a place where you began to, from that horror of that dynamic of war, to begin to utilize it to create a reflection of peace. But the whole dynamic of the military industrial complex that had been developed during World War II needed something to do. And it could only make so many washing machines and refrigerators. And you could only turn out so many things in that sort of way. But there was also a dynamic of a power vacuum, and into any sort of power vacuum, there are those with a certain amount of arrogance, a certain amount of, what shall we say, scheming nature, that would use and abuse the dynamic for their own ends. And even though it might have begun innocently enough, in fact, you began to utilize, because you were the exceptional nation, you began to utilize that dynamic in a power over situation in your world. And so, part of it might have been a reaction to, oh, we're never going to allow something like this to happen in our world again, so we're going to control it as much as possible, which is not freedom, which is not liberty. So 1947 was a very pivotal year in this dynamic. It was the first year of Roswell, believe it or not. Very few of you think about that dynamic. It was the year the channel was born. It was there was many dynamics happened in those first years. The CIA was established. The Cold War began. The UN was developed and voted in the State of Israel. As far as technically goes, transistors, mobile phones, cameras, instant cameras. You broke the sound barrier that year. It was huge leap forward in many things. But it was also a year that many consolidated the dynamics of control. Because remember, dear ones, you either create your reality or you allow it. You had a whole population who had just been through the horrors of a war and were coming home, and we would suggest to you that all that most of those men and women wanted was to live a life of peace. And you did. You accomplished so much. You moved forward in so many ways. You developed your society and your culture in so many different ways. You were so creative and so productive, and you just kept moving forward within the dynamics of your own success, within the dynamics of your own feelings of becoming more. But as you became more, you allowed more and more of your reality to be created by others. You allowed yourselves to be swayed by jingoism and propaganda, as you even are today. Some of you might even consider what we're saying to you propaganda. Perhaps it's divine propaganda. So as you're going through, you went through the 50s and all of that stuff, and Soviet Union, and now here you are. Here you are, dear ones. 2019, Donald Trump. The whole dynamic of impeachment, the spectacle, let us say. The whole dynamic of America and humanity being at loggerheads with each other over religion, over race, over political background. It seems like everything that you can consider to divide yourselves, to keep yourselves separate from each other, you have been doing, and the divisiveness is getting to the point where even the most calm of you, even the most serene, are beginning to say enough. You stand on the verge of 2020. It's right before New Year's as we present this dynamic. You have been being told over and over again by so many in your world that the apocalypse is right around the corner. That gloom and doom, that the dynamic of global warming is going to either fry you or freeze you. The sun is either going to scorch you or turn off, and so many are screaming about the dynamics of each other and blaming and blaming and blaming. When in fact, the only thing that is required is that you begin to awaken, that you begin to understand that there is an awakening taking place in your world that will be happening with increasing rapidity and increasing pressure, especially in the first 2 months of 2020. You're in a little bit of a lull of energy right now, in case you hadn't noticed. The politicians aren't screaming because they're all home. So the TV is not screaming divisiveness. Yeah, you are all wrong, all of you, and you are all right. You all have the ability to change everything. As these new influences take root in your world, and we're not going to tell you how they're going to happen, but you'll notice them, and it's imminent. It is imminent, dear ones. As you begin to notice these things, we wish to tell you, it's not all gloom and doom. we would suggest to you that even though there are going to be great changes, there doesn't have to be that dynamic of great upheaval and pain and carnage. Because this is a change of humanity, a change of reality, that people are going to begin to think and feel through the dynamics of their heart. Now, we don't wish to be so corny as to say love is going to take over everything, because half of you, most of you, do not know the definition of love. Caring, compassion, connection. You know, you have been on a long journey of individuation as a species. As a species, you had that childhood which is in your sacred texts, your history books, as that time in paradise, that time in the garden. That time in the garden when you had a collective consciousness, a collective awareness, a collective relationship with all that is. There was no separation between any of you. There was no separation between you and nature, and there was no separation between nature and spirit. There was no delineation of consciousness in that sort of way. You were one with all, and all was one with you. And that level of collective awareness is in many ways so soft that it allows for collective manifestation. But there was really no dynamic of individual manifestation. Oh, yes, there were differences with you, but there was not the individuality, the individual nature, the individual connection with all that is that you have now. You see, dear ones, that was the purpose of your journey, to be able to move to that place of collective awareness, to standing on the verge of your adulthood right now. You have moved into the dynamic of individual nature, individual relationship with all that is. And whether you're consciously aware of it or not now, you, each and every one of you, have that ability. It is now time, with the onset of this new decade, with the changes that are going to be occurring imminently, for you to begin to realize that the answers for each and every one of you is to begin to come together. Caring, connection, compassion. You are one species. You are earthly humanity. Earthly humanity who has an indelible and powerful connection with spirit, unlike any other species in the universe. There is so much attention being paid to you now from others, simply because you are about to reclaim your power of collective manifestation. And all you have to do is get enough of you on the same page. It doesn't even have to be all of you. Because if a person doesn't agree with how you wish to create and how you are creating your reality, they will join and they will create their realities with others that are more like them. And morality and the dynamic of doing the right thing is the bottom energy at all of this. It's time to build a world based on fairness. It's time to build a world that stands with their connection from that spark of the divine that exists within each and every one of you. How many of you would point to your heart if we asked you where that spark of the divine is located? For yes, that is where it is located. So we have a message for you, a message of the future, a message of possibility, a message of a reality that if you look outside of you and you listen to the reflection of others, they would say, no, no, gloom and doom, negativity and all of that. And we say to you, you have the possibility of creating a future of your dreams coming true, of peace and prosperity, of the celebration of the individual nature and the realization of the connection of all humanity. The willingness to come together in small and large groups to begin to manifest the solutions to the problems that are existing in your world because you have not been very well organized. That's an understatement. And you would understand the joke that we're coming through the channel talking about organization. Right, Adrian?
I just was smiling a big smile at that one. All right.
Right. So, dear ones, you have the possibility of creating a future with your dreams coming true. Here's just a small suggestion. So many of you are afraid of AI. But what if you had a heart-centered technology? You already have the dynamics of travel that you could go to anywhere on this planet within 1 hour. That technology already exists and is producible with the manufacturing abilities that you have now. Anti-gravity, we believe. There is also the dynamic of free energy. Beyond Tesla, beyond Edison, beyond those dynamics of where you pull energy from space, from the ethers, to power your homes, your cars, your computers. What if you could create a future where you didn't have to worry about surviving, where AI and robotics, heart-centered, because you as the creators of it, if you have heart-centeredness and fairness about the dynamic and you are flexible, as all humanity needs to be flexible and to be able to adjust to changing situations, adaptable, let us say, if everyone already has enough, and AI took over all the mundane tasks, and you could be anyone that you wished simply by putting out the effort, simply by doing the study, simply by exploring the art, simply by writing the book, simply by racing the race, competing in the ways that you do, but in productive ways. What could you create, dear ones? What could you create? Who could you be? Could you dream the possibility of a dream that was beyond your wildest imagination? Could you imagine living in a world that celebrated your life and your creativity simply because you're human? What a world. What a possibility. What a lack of struggle. Does the dynamic of duality still exist in your world? Yeah. But the best defense against aggression is to live in a world of peace that does not allow for that level of conflict, and it doesn't make you vulnerable. In fact, through the collective desire of an entire humanity, of an entire species, there would be nothing that would be able to touch you. Nothing. So that safety and that security necessary in order to create real peace, peace with enough for all, we know it's hard to imagine from where you stand right now. But we'll be back every week between now and 2 months from now, so we'll be giving you updates on this whole thing. But we wish to tell you, 2 months from now, you're not going to recognize your world. All right. All right. Well, so we want to tell you the future is bright. From our perspective, you have already made it. All you really have to do is weather the next 2 to 3 months. So we would suggest that you do what is necessary. It would be good to have maybe a couple of weeks of food in the house, some water available. Not that it's going to be, the power may go out for a while, but it's only going to be for a relatively short period of time. The services may be interrupted, but they will only be interrupted for a relatively short period of time. There's going to be an apocalypse, but it's not going to be for you, dear ones. It's going to be for those that are the controllers in your world. Because they've let it go too far. The whole dynamic, we started to talk about 1947 and all of that stuff, but you went from one political party to another political party to another political party, but the game has always been war. And in the dynamics of war, whoever you were fighting and all of that, whatever political party was in power was feeding at the corruption trough. And the corruption began to build right after World War II and has continued to build even to, 2016, where this orange guy stepped in and said, we're not going to do this anymore. And all of the dynamics of energy, all of the screaming, all of the yelling, all of the, disjointed attacks are because that very dynamic of corruption that is endemic within your system sees its own end and protests loudly. That's what's changing, dear ones. those that are corrupt in your world will no longer be in power. Things are going to change, and so will you. Those of you out there that have been looking for that dynamic of a heart-centered world, it's going to be yours. All right.